One of the most important things when it comes to journalism, I think, is allowing the communities that are doing the actual groundwork to make decisions for themselves and to have a real stake at the table. I think one of the issues when it comes to the way that money is moving, especially in nonprofit or independent or alternative journalism, is that there are decision makers who are deciding where these funds are going without necessarily having a real stake in the community that they're trying to serve, and that those funds in theory are benefiting. So if you put some of that decision making power, or you create more opportunities to bring the communities that are actually going to benefit from these funds to the table to actually have a discussion where funders can be receptive and listen truly to what the needs of the community are, that feels like a really important place to start. So creating more avenues, maybe outside of traditional philanthropy, to have conversations like that, where there's more unrestricted funding, where there's opportunities to sit down at a table and be receptive to one another and methodically kind of nail down what those needs are. That feels like a really important place to begin, especially when you're talking about such a large sum of money. Again, I think part of the job as an editor, at least at a small community newspaper, is one, to embed yourself in the community in an authentic way. So I think a lot of the time when it comes to community work, especially in kind of a post-COVID, post-2020 era, is that so much of this work can become performative, or you're doing it in a way that is to tell someone else that you're doing the work, essentially, and it can become quite vague. And I think part of the job of an editor, any good journalist, is to really, for one, be a part of the community without any kind of other alternative agenda. Do you know your neighbors? Do you live in the community? Do you actually frequent the businesses and the store owners that you're reporting on? Have you taken the time to create real relationships with these people so that there is a more trustful relationship? Because that's the reason that a lot of ethnic media exists to begin with, is that it's not necessarily because well, for one, I think a lot of our communities, at least in the Chinatown International District in Seattle, which is where we report, a lot of the stories that were being reported in the Seattle Times or some of the larger media outlets were just that there's crime here, or it's very dangerous, or it just is making headlines for a lot of quote unquote negative things. And while there are those things that are happening that are being reported on, it's also so much more nuanced than that. And I think that's where community media comes in, which I think is largely underfunded and also underappreciated and taken for granted in a lot of different ways, because we step in to create an alternative narrative and also an authentic one to the people who really live here. So if a reporter is coming in from North Seattle, for example, if you're familiar with this area, and then reporting on the South End, it's a very different story that's going to come out of that versus a reporter who lives and works here and whose aunties own, the store across the way or serve dim sum on the corner. So you're going to get a very different story out of that. And so I think that's like part of what makes the difference. I think I would want to really make sure to do my research and to sit down with these communities. The value of an ethnic press, the value of a strong uh, ethnic press in a major city like Seattle, for example, is just that there needs to be an actual diversity of voices. So not one that feels performative in any way, but that is real, to actually reflect these growing communities and these shifting demographics that are changing really rapidly, especially in our neighborhood as we come up against institutional issues like displacement and gentrification, that have just been baked into the history of the neighborhood. So I would encourage those folks who are deciding how to fund smaller newsrooms across the country to really sit down with those communities, with journalists who are doing that work on the ground, and asking questions and being as receptive as possible. I think so when you're dealing with that much money, you want to be as intentional and thoughtful as possible, to make sure that the dollars that are being allotted are really going to be sustainable, and to help set up some infrastructure that creates some sustainability. I want to see a really strong media landscape. Right now, we, as a public, often rely on a handful of major media outlets. And although that is all well and good, it's such a indication of the health of a democratic society, how many voices are really actually included, how we fund those voices is determined by investors like the Pivot Fund and other funders who are hoping to shift their philanthropy methods and the way that they assess who is quote unquote deserving of this kind of funding. But I do think that a strong media landscape that is actually diverse and not just reliant on mainstream media outlets is quite indicative of the health of a society at large. And so I would love to just see a much stronger contingency of local media, of different voices who have the funding and have the infrastructure and the bandwidth to tell stories from different communities authentically, because I think ultimately that will encourage much more civic discourse. It will make sure more members of our society are in a healthy place and able to participate in a real way, that is culturally responsive. And yeah, I'm very excited and hopeful based on where things are going.